Okay, so I was going to talk about the art of storytelling in Celtic communities. And the art of storytelling among the Celts is not that different from the art of storytelling among other people who have a classic tradition of doing so, an importance, community importance to storytelling. But of cultural traditions that have survived into the modern period, they're probably, at least in Europe, at least in the Western world, among the peoples that have taken storytelling the most seriously and that have perpetuated it in many communities as a sacred art, which was the original function of storytelling. And you still get a great deal of that in the work of the greatest storytellers that were still around in the 20th century in particular Celtic communities. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and give you a sense of who the storytellers were, what they did when they were telling stories, what they were trying to do, what they meant to do, and what were the tools of their trade, that is, how did they articulate the stories to convey those meanings to their audience. And I'll be drawing on particularly storytelling from the west of Ireland, storytelling from the west and north of Brittany, because these are the places where this kind of art flourished for the longest period and was really well recorded. And also to some extent also from the western islands of Scotland, although that was a dying art at the time when people were starting to take it down and take a serious interest in it. Storytelling in a Celtic community, of course anyone could tell stories, right? You heard a great story, you would just reproduce it because it was entertaining, because it got people's attention. But some members of the community were professional storytellers. You went to them when you wanted to hear a story well told. And the person who was doing the storytelling would be called either a scéalaí. A scéalaí simply means a storyteller. Scéal is a story in Irish. So a scéalaí is someone who knows how to tell a story well. That's all that's the craft, the art that he has. Or he could also be called a seanchaí. And nowadays, of course, in English-speaking Ireland, people often use the term seanchaí to just mean anyone who can tell a story in an exciting, clever way, regardless of what kind of story it is. That's not at all what the term seanchaí means in traditional Irish, that is among communities that speak Irish. A seanchaí means someone who talks about old things. A seanchaí is the memory of the community. A seanchaí is someone who, on the one hand, knows recent events, like who in the community is related to whom, what kind of relationships existed between certain families in your community for many generations back, and this is the cause of certain conflicts, or this is the cause of certain alliances, or there are certain agreements that were made by certain families within recent history, and it's important for people to keep that in mind. So the seanchaí is the one who knows about that, who can actually tell you the story of how it originally happened and why these agreements were made and why they should still be binding. So for that reason, the seanchaí is very important, but simply as being the memory of the community, the person who knows everybody's business and is expected to, and is able to provide people with that information whenever it's needed. And usually that information is provided in the form of a story. You actually tell the story of, these two families have this feud because of some land dispute that they had 2 generations ago. And this is exactly the way it happened. And you will give the names of the characters, and you will act it out. You will actually say, who did what first, and why the sense of grievance got accentuated, and why it actually degenerated into a feud. And you'll make people understand it through your storytelling, through your ability to conjure up that past event. So then this will have an effect on the present community. The present community will say, okay, well, that was a very good reason for a feud, and that explains why this is going on, and there's no reason why it should not be going on. Or they would say, what a stupid reason for a feud, And that will then lay the grounds for negotiations and for actually ending this state of tension in the community, depending on how the story was told and the actual facts of the case as the Shanachi remembered it. So that's one function of the Shanachi and one function of storytelling, again, because the Shanachi does everything through stories. He'll explain genealogies, again, through stories, by telling you, who married when and what circumstances this happened in, and give you the context of each event so that it sticks in the memory, so that you remember, oh yes, you can see how it relates to other things. You can remember it in order, chronologically, because it makes sense, because you can see how certain events follow from other events, and how whatever you're talking about then fits into this larger picture. It makes it easier to visualize and understand. However, there's another aspect of storytelling, and this is where the shkeli can come in, who can just tell any story entertainingly. The Shanachi always is a shkeli. Shanachi is always someone who knows how to tell stories with art in a striking and expressive manner. And there are certain stories that belong to the community. They're not necessarily stories about anyone you know. They're not necessarily stories about ancestors you can actually point to, down the generations. But they're stories that belong to the community for their ritual importance, because they somehow fit into the life of the community. They have a mythological importance. They're part of the foundation myth of the community. And the Shanachi is the only one who knows these stories. Of course, his auditors, the people who listen to him, know the stories too, but they don't consider themselves competent to actually tell the stories in the right way. Now, in modern times, of course, the primary function of the storyteller is to entertain his audience. I mean, that was always his function. You don't tell stories unless they're entertaining, or people eventually fall asleep during the presentation. But nowadays, you can tell a story just because it's entertaining. You will go to a storyteller for that experience and no other. In a traditional Celtic community, storytelling, especially if it involved mythical stories, had a particular ritual function, and you couldn't, especially some of the great stories, the stories that were felt to have the deepest significance in the life of the community, couldn't be told just for entertainment's sake. They couldn't be just told at any time, in any occasion, just because you wanted to hear that story. The story had to be told at a particular time of year, at a particular time of the day. It had to take a certain amount of time in the telling, and all of those things had to be respected. The storytelling season was in the winter. The traditional season was starting in Samhain, and theoretically up to Beltane, that is the entire dark half of the year, but really the 3 winter months between Samhain and Emok, between Laie de Brite. And this was considered to be the darkest time of the year, and it was the time that was associated with the sleep of the land, the renewal of the land, so that you could start another cycle of agriculture, of work, and sort of bringing new life to the community after this period of renewal. And it was the period in which you communed with the ancestors. And remember that at Samhain, of course, is when you invite the ancestors back, right? The living and the dead sort of mingle at that time, but the ritual significance of that was felt throughout the season that followed it. The ancestor is sort of always there listening somehow. And what you were doing during the winter months was trying to get them on your side. You were trying to recreate the bond between the living and the dead. You were trying to recreate the sense of continuity that had always been there in the past.
You make it sound as if the storyteller was always a man.
The storyteller was pretty much always a man. There were some great women storytellers, and I'll mention a couple of them, but it tended to be a man, especially in the Gaelic countries. But in Brittany, actually, a lot of the greatest storytellers were women. But there was a tendency for them to be men. And I think this simply came from the fact that it was originally a priestly function. So you tended to expect it to be a man, because that particular ritual function was usually assured by a man, who would do much more than storytelling, right? But eventually storytelling came to be the only way he exercised his art in in a Christianized community. But yes, there have been women storytellers. They often were, however, considered to be scéalaithe, that is, in Irish, storyteller, just people who tell stories, as opposed to seanchaithe, who were people who speak about old things, who have that authority of bringing the ancestors back to our time. And so during this season, you're trying to reconnect with the ancestors, and one of the ways of doing that is to tell about events that happened long ago. So you go back to the creation of the world, you go back to the ancient heroic age, the time when there were heroes who were larger than life and who did certain striking and important things that you couldn't do today. And you reconnect with that time, with that way of thinking and that way of being. This is a way of gaining new energy for the present. You go back to the source, you go back to the way things were when they were less corrupt and less decayed than they are now. This is a very common theme in Fenian, which is, that people used to be giants, people used to have incredible strength. When Uiscin, who is the last surviving Fenian, is tricked into, well, actually isn't tricked, he returns from fairyland, from the land of the young, after having been there for many hundreds of years, and he's tricks himself into staying, into being stuck in the mortal world. And he's horrified by the fact that all the people in Ireland seem to have become tiny and puny and weak, and he's the only one who has the strength of ancient days, even though he, actually this is how he's caught, is because he sees that the weak, puny people of future Ireland have found the horn of Finn McCool, one of the versions of the story, and it's such a huge horn that they can't pick it up. And so he, of course, he's there on his magic horse, and he says, these silly little people can't pick up such a small object, and so he puts out his arm to pick it up, and in order to bend down low enough, he has to put one of his feet on the ground, and as soon as he touches the land of Ireland, he's caught back in time. He's back, he's now in real time, and then he loses all his strength, of course, because he's hundreds of years old. So all of the time that he spent suspended, not aging in fairyland, and now comes back onto him. But there's this notion again that the Fianna, in the days of the Fianna, people were heroic, people were strong, people were great, and after that it was all downhill. So you're trying to go back to that time when people were great and heroic and strong, and making the present generation feel that, as though they were actually reliving that time. Not surprisingly, in Ireland and in Scotland, the main ingredient of the storytelling season is Feniacht. Feniacht is the Lord of the Fianna. It's the stories about Finn McCool and the warrior bands of his time. These were people who were supposed to live in a kind of counterculture. They left their families, they left their land, they forsook any kind of inheritance that they might have in their birth communities, and they lived among each other in basically voluntary communities, where as hunters and gatherers in the woods, and as mercenary warriors, so that they were, in a sense, independent of society. And so there's a whole series of stories, of course, about Finn McCool, who was the leader of one of these bands, and eventually also the Fenian who had a contract as a mercenary with the King of Ireland. So he became the Riaine, the royal Fenian, and as such the preeminent Fenian over all of the Fianna of Ireland. And he had companions who were given particular characters, the very easily recognizable personalities, rather like Robin Hood and his men, right, where each of the men has a very particular, instantly recognizable profile. So Finn McCool has Caoilte, who's sort of the diplomat and the nice guy among his followers, and he has Conan, who's the grumbler, the sort of nasty fat guy who's a coward but always acts with a great deal of bluster and aggressiveness. And he has Uiscin, who's his son, who was born of a supernatural mother, was enchanted into the form of a deer, so that he's not quite of this world. And so he has prophetic abilities, and he is the mystic, more or less, of the Fenians. And then his own son, Oscar, is the one who's always about fair play. Whenever there's a conflict among the Fenians, Oscar comes in and he says, no, you'll do this and you'll do that, you know. And no, I can't countenance that you should do this, you know, but you have the advantage over this other person, so forth. So all of these are very vividly drawn personalities. And the thrill of Feniacht is how they interact with each other. It's how these very, very different people can manage to cooperate and work towards a common goal. It's often the excitement of the stories in that. But the primary importance of Feniacht is that the Fianna, now when people talk about Fenian lore, and they often accentuate the warrior aspect of the Fianna. I think Fianna are primarily warriors, and you have a lot of sort of modern, sort of romantic approaches to being a warrior, and people often look to Feniacht as warrior culture, and how you know, to study the way the Fianna behaved in battle is the Celtic warrior ethos that you're going to try and regain in the modern world. You see a lot of that in sort of Celtic Reconstructionist movements that have a kind of warrior militia aspect to them. And this is actually not true at all of the ancient Celtic world, because the Fianna are atypical warriors. They're countercultural warriors. They don't at all behave the way established cultural warriors, you know, acting in the name of their own tribe, representing their own established community, would have acted at all. And to the audience of the Fenian tale, that's not the primary characteristic of the Fenians. The Fenians are warriors, yes, and they get into all kinds of fights, and they have adventures that involve a lot of fighting and swordplay and things like that. But that's not their main function. Their main function really is survival. And the big thing about the Fianna is that they live out in the wilderness, and that's where they have their adventures. They have their adventures among creatures that are not quite human, that are on the boundary between the human and the wild. They meet a lot of fairy races that are half animal. A lot of the adventures they have are with the dog heads and the cat heads and the pig heads, all these different half animal fairies. And the whole notion is that where the Fenians are, there's no real dividing line between the human and the animal, between the tame and the wild, between culture and nature. And that's what's great about the Fiannas. They can pass through that barrier whenever they want to. They're human. They know what it is to be human. They know what needs humans have. They'd have the same needs for shelter and food and companionship that settled humans have. But at the same time, they know what it is to be wild. They can understand animals. They can hunt animals because they know exactly what it feels like to be an animal. And they can put themselves into the mind space of the animal. And sometimes in the stories, they can turn into animals themselves. They can turn into the animals that they hunt. Again, Oisin is the son of a deer. The deer is the main prey animal. That's the main animal that you hunt. And so Oisin is not quite a human and not quite a deer. Right? He's sort of in that in-between state of being both the hunter and the prey. So what you get from these stories is the energy of drawing what makes you live, what nurtures you from the land, from physical nature, where all of your nourishment comes from, and bringing it into the realm of culture, bringing it into the human community. Only the Fianna can do that because they're right on the border. So during the season, at the dark of the year, you tell these stories about the people who can do this, the people who cross across this boundary. And that is going to bring fertility back to your community. This is going to encourage everything in the land around you, everything, all the energies that are involved around you, to collaborate in this passing across the border from the wild to the human, to the civilized. Now, how are you going to do this to get people's attention? There are a series of formulaic practices whereby the storyteller, first of all, indicates to his audience what kind of story this is. Because the storyteller can tell all kinds of stories. He can warm up a session of storytelling by telling stories that he knows are not really sacred stories. A lot of these are stories that we call international folk tales. You know, these are stories that, sort of like a lot of Grimm's fairy tales have that pattern. You find them in many, many different countries across Europe and Asia. They've obviously been sort of imitated by one storyteller from other storytellers, so that you have similar versions from China and from Ireland. And these stories are known everywhere, and sometimes they're actually descended from mythological stories that used to have a more strong ritualistic meaning. But when the people tell them, they know that this is not an important myth. So they're not usually presented in the same way. You can tell this is a warm-up story, right? That we're telling right now. We're going to get into the really heavy story that is going to be presented more carefully in a ritual way, and then you're going to have to pay greater attention, obviously, because you'll be cued into paying greater attention to the more mythological story. So in different Celtic communities, you have different ways of doing this, of entering into this kind of mythological space. It's really a way of setting sacred space for the telling of the story. Certain words tell you that, okay, this is the way it's going to be. In Brittany, there are several ways of inducing this state. One of my favorite ones, is a very short one, is saying, "Elvishiwa, Elvishnu akit, Elvishiwa bipred." And it means literally, once there was, once there wasn't, once there always was. And on one level, you could say "Elvishiwa bipred" just simply means, you know, once it was anyway, you know. But the way it's phrased in a sort of slightly stilted manner makes you think, you know, what does that mean? That something actually was, but it wasn't, and nevertheless, in all circumstances, it was. So this tells you that the story is going to be a myth, right? This is a story. This is something that is true. It doesn't have to be factual. It didn't necessarily happen at any one particular time, and yet, in some ways, it has always happened. Another way of doing it in Brittany, there's a silhouette de geklifet, markaret de kretfet, markalt ne kretfet kid, situemus de laret. And that's a very common one that's used. It means listen and you'll hear. If you want, you'll believe it. If you don't want to, you won't believe it. But this is what I have to say. And that's sort of a less heavy introduction. And another one that's very commonly used in the north of Brittany is Elvishiwa, Elvishivo. Commencement an ol gozo. Nisus namar namartizen. Inus trisroad antriben. And it's an enigmatic statement. It says, once there was, and once there will be. This is the way all talk begins. And there is no if or maybe about it. The tripod has 3 legs. So that again introduces the fact that you're at the same time talking about something that's true now, that was true in the past, and that will still be true in the future. And it's an indisputable fact. So you have to believe this particular story. In Irish, at least in Connemara, there's a formula that's sort of longish and that introduces just about all stories that are meant to be taken in that spirit. It says, "Vi an for those vi, Da méint sin úr sin an, ní bhéin is an. Da méin an is agus an úr sin an, bhíh scéal úr na sin scéalagam, na bhéin gan éin scéal. And then you run into the story. So it's actually hard to translate, but it means, there once was, a long time ago there was. Now, if I had been there that time, I wouldn't be here now. Yes. And if I were here now and that time, then I would have another story at me and an old story at the same time. Right? Or I might be without any story at all. And anyway, and then it goes launches into the actual story. But the effect of all of these phrases is that it confuses the audience as to the factual nature of the story and when the story is supposed to be taking place, and their relation to the story as either people in the here and now hearing something about the here and now, or hearing something about the ancient past, or hearing about something that is true of both now and the ancient past.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Did they have endings for stories
Yes.
that were ritualized in
Yes.
the same way?
And I'm going to get to them, but well,
But not yet.
I'll get to
They
them
were
in a
sort
moment.
of telling people to suspend judgment at
Right.
the outset.
Yes, and also the idea that this is a story that has to be believed, but it's not a factual story, and yet it's true.
Okay.
It's truer than many factual stories, is the idea. So, talking about, in Scotland, people are usually, do it simpler. They simply say, "Van er visha," there was before this time. Just simply placing the event in the past. Now, the endings of stories in Ireland, very typically, the meaning of the story is given by the ending. The way you end a story, a great story, an important story in the west of Ireland is the blessing of God on the souls of the dead. That's the end of every story. Because each story is a gift, is an offering to the ancestors. And that's the ultimate meaning of the story for the audience. This is a communing with the ancestors. This is a gift to the ancestors. We're reviving their time. They have been present. And, of course, in a Christianized setting, you ask for the blessing of God on their souls. The stories, as I said, can be of many different kinds. The centerpiece of a storytelling session during the winter months would be a Fenian story, a story about Finn McCool and his men. An adventure, usually which involves either the saving of a girl who represents fertility, sovereignty, sort of the correct functioning of the community, usually represented as a woman who is able to give life and to continue things, and sometimes as a kind of regaining of power that was lost, very much like the Arthurian stories about the wasteland, about the Fisher King who loses his virility, right, is wounded, and you have to go to the land of women, where the Holy Grail is, in order to return that fertility to the here and now after the land has been made waste. Very many Fenian stories have that at their center. In the parts of the Celtic world where you don't speak Gaelic, and so you don't have stories about Finn McCool, you often have stories very similar to that, that follow the pattern of the Grail myth. The great stories in Brittany, talking about Brittany being the British Celtic country, that is the Brythonic country that is related to Welsh, where you still have that sort of great storytelling tradition, oral storytelling. The great myths are basically the Grail legend in various forms that are told. But again, they all have that common theme of bringing fertility back in some way. It's been lost in the other world, lost in the past, lost in places where you can't normally regain it except through the imagination, through rekindling the power of the ancestors in the sacred space where you're telling stories. So, Fenian, as I said, is therefore the centerpiece stories, but you could tell other stories that are part of other matters, you know, traditions of storytelling. For instance, you could tell stories, especially in Ulster, but stories about Cuchulainn, right? Stories about Cruchor MacNessa, where they're often not introduced in the same way, because they're not felt to be about the same kind of thing, but they have the same kind of prestige as being associated with ancient times. Then how do you build the story so that you make it make sense to the audience? In Celtic framework, you want there to be certain correspondences in the numbers and the colors, the genders of the characters and so forth, so that they form patterns that work cumulatively in the building of the story. So for instance, in Celtic storytelling, and this is true of other traditions, but I mean in Celtic especially, the number 3 is extremely important. You have these triads in which something has to be gone through 3 times so that it sticks. Sometimes you make it be 9 times so that the 9 is the more powerful 3. But it's even striking when stories are told that are known in literary tradition. Their written forms are very well known in you know, Irish literature, but they're, the live storyteller reconstructs them so that they have this kind of symbolic structure to them. For instance, the story of Deidre. This is one of the few Ulster cycle stories that are still very popular and are retold by, you know, the Shanachis in both Irish and Scottish communities. And usually there are things woven into the story that are not part of the literary versions of the stories, but that work beautifully within the context of the expectations of a Celtic audience. For instance, well, even in the literary version of the story of Deidre, she has 3 visions. You know, Deidre, in the literary version, she's the daughter of a retainer of King Cruchor of Ulster. Okay, so story of Deidre, her parentage is different in different sources. In the literary versions, she's usually the daughter of a retainer of King Cruchor of Ulster, and as the king is making his rounds, staying in various homes of his retainers as he goes through Ulster, he's staying at this man's house, and the man's wife is pregnant, and she gives birth that night, and there's a horrible scream that's heard as the young girl is being born, and you know, all of the warriors of the king jump up and grab their weapons and start fighting each other in panic, not knowing who the attacker is. And the druid, Catha, or Catha in modern Irish, prophesies that this girl child is going to cause untold misery to the people of the world, because she'll be so beautiful that all men will want to possess her, and they will kill each other for her. And for that reason she's called Deidre, which means trouble. And
what is that?
Yeah.
Deidre?
Deidre.
After
Deidre,
that.
right?
Deidre.
Deidre is and so the reaction of the Ulster court is that this child has to be killed immediately, right? So that she doesn't cause all this trouble. But the king thinks she's going to be the most beautiful woman in the world. Well, I have the authority, I'm going to keep her for myself. So he sets it up so that this older woman, Leorcham, who's an aristocratic woman, but who was some sort of warrior, it's not quite sure, some sort of woman warrior, but who now serves as a foster parent for aristocratic children. And so she's fostered to this woman and is made to never ever see a man, or at least a younger man, because this woman is married, she does have a husband, but it's an older man, so it's not considered as threatening. And until eventually fate finds her in the form of the three colors that make her visualize what a beautiful young man would look like, even though she's never seen one. And this is always retained in the folk tellings of the story. In the story of, as told by Eamon Burke, who was one of the last great Shanachies in Connacht and Connemara in the 20th century, she's the daughter of Manannán MacLear, but for no particular reason. She just decides, the storyteller decided this was appropriate. And there's no druid, but Manannán himself knows, because he's magical, when this child is born, that she's going to cause untold misery. So he runs away and he's going to drown her. And King Crachur sees that this is happening. He says, why are you going to drown this baby? So he explains, of course, that this woman is going to be the most beautiful woman in the world, and she's going to be so beautiful that men are just going to go crazy over her and kill each other. So, of course, the king reacts as he does in the literary story. He says, well, no, I'm going to control her. I'm going to have her entirely for myself. And Eamon Burke goes to quite some detail in how he arranges this so that she absolutely never sees another man. And then she has the vision of the three colors, and that's the same in all versions of the story, because it's such a striking image, when it's Samhain and snow falls, and it's when cattle are being slaughtered before winter, you know, all the cattle that you're not going to actually keep through the winter and feed, you slaughter. And she sees blood from a calf being slaughtered on the white snow, and a black raven comes to pluck at the snow. And she thinks, you know, could be a young man who has a skin as white as the snow, and hair as black as this raven, and cheeks as red as this blood. And in the folk version, this is confirmed. One of the women who serves her says, oh yes, there's a man exactly like that, exactly like you're imagining. And this is Naoise, Naoise, son of Uisne in the folk version. And he, and the storyteller then does is present this as a triad. He says, going to ask the king to let you go to a particular gathering that is going to take place at the court, and all of the warriors of the king are going to go past. So this will be the first time she actually sees men. And she actually tricks the king into accepting this, basically showing that now she's a grown woman and she knows about these things. Not so. The king eventually relents and lets her see these women. She's told that you're going to see one man who is incredibly beautiful. You're going to think it's him. But that's not. That's Naoise's little brother, Ardon. And let him go past. Don't let him seduce you. He's not the one. Then you're going to see a second man go past, and he's going to be even more like your vision. And you're really going to fall for him, but no, this is Alil, or Al as he's called in the Connemara version. This is Al, he's Naoise's second brother. And, you know, don't give in to him because there's better coming. And then the third one that's going to come, that's Naoise. This is the one that you're going to, who is destined for you.
How's leash spelled?
N-O-I-S.
Oh, Noit. Oh,
Leash, leash.
Oh, because my name's Leisha.
Yes. Or leash. Or Naoise in Irish, but in the version, Eamon Burke's version, is just called Naoise. And here you have this sort of cumulative building through three sections, which is what the Celtic audience wants. This is what makes it work. So, in fact, she's looking at the warriors coming in, and Ardon comes in first, and he's described as this extremely appealing young man who's strong and you know, suggests a running animal, and is so full of this energy that Deidre rather is extremely attracted to him. But she remembers, no, this is not him. You know, he's totally desirable, but it's not the one. And then Al appears, and he's described as even more spectacular. There's like solar imagery surrounding him, and he's full of this energy that is almost irresistible. But no, she resists because she knows there's better to come. And then Naoise appears, and it's like, you know, sunrise, and she is completely swept off her feet. But she knows that it was right to wait for this, and the audience also knows that it was right to wait for this. You feel this sense of fulfillment once the 3 phases have gone through, and you reach the 3rd one, and that's that. In the Scottish version, there's a section where the 3 colors appear in reversed, talking about death instead of love. And this is, Laois eventually runs away with Deidre, quite involuntarily. Deidre basically puts a taboo, a compulsion on him that you're going to have to run away with me, there's no choice. And they run away to Scotland, and they live in hiding in Scotland for a while. In Eamon O'Rourke's version, the King of Scotland actually tries to get Deidre for himself, and Laois has to fight with him. There's a whole series of adventures that he has to go through to protect Deidre. But then eventually, they're told by the King of Ulster that it's safe to go back to Ireland. That, okay, King of Ulster has accepted the situation, is letting them come back. And what happens in the different versions is different. But in one of the Scottish versions, she has the vision of the 3 colors again, but she sees them again as cumulatively. One of them is she sees 3 white doves with gobs of honey in their mouths. And she asks Laois, resolve for me the difficulty of my story. What does this mean? He says, this is nothing but empty delusion and feminine depression, Deidre, my love. But of course, the white doves represent the honeymoon period, right? The period where she was actually out of time with Laois, basically living her love, living her idol, sort of not caring about social contacts, what other people, how the other people impinged on their lives. Then she has the next vision. She sees 3 hawks with cruel bills and holding gobs of blood in their hooked bills. And so she has the same response from Laois, but this is, of course, the conflict that's eventually going to come to meet them as they come back into the reality of the relations with the king and the court and all of that. And then finally she has the vision. I saw 3 black ravens on the yew tree of death. And that's how it's going to end. So the 3 colors returning in reverse. Again, 3 sections, but this time 3 diminishing sections. In some versions of the stories, there's another 3 that you go through, is the children of Uisne, Laois and his brothers, have a spell of protection on them, that they cannot be hurt by fire or water or earth. And so they go through a testing. The king tries to destroy them by building a tower that's made out of metal, and by having a tub of water that outside, and they then heating the tower of metal so that it's burning, and then having them run out and plunge into the tub of water and get drowned. So either they get burned in the tub of, or they get drowned in the tub of water. And so they're with Deirdre in the tower, and so they have to find a way of saving Deirdre, because they're impervious to the flames, or they're impervious to the mound falling down on them, and they're impervious to being drowned in the water. But Deirdre isn't. And so they manage to save her from the flames by the hot metal, by getting around her and facing outwards, by having her in the middle. They manage to save her from the water, again by holding her up, and they manage to, but they can't save her from the earth. They can't save her from being crushed by the mound of earth being dropped down on them. So they have to give in at that point. And they come out, and a net is thrown on them, and they're slaughtered, usually in the versions at that point. But again, you have 3 tests, so that the audience expects this period, sort of punctuation over 3 periods going through. So, so this gives you a bit of a sense of how the audience reacts to the story and how the storyteller knows how to build the story in order to meet their expectations. In more mythological stories with supernatural beings, very often you have the concept of movement through 3 levels, and they're often represented by 3 metals: copper, silver, and gold. In the Scottish stories that are usually about the gile glass, often translated the grey lad, or it could be the green lad. You're fighting against, there's a confrontation with 3 giants, and the 3 monsters have a copper realm and a silver realm and a gold realm, and you sort of go up through the spheres, so to speak, until you're in the highest gold realm. In one of the stories told by Eamon O'Rourke about Cuchulainn, which is a variant of how Cuchulainn becomes the champion of Ireland by going through the fairy mounds where he's tested by all these horrible apparitions. He and 2 other Ulster heroes go, in this case, to the King of Connacht, who plays that role in the story we have. And they're given, one of them is given a cup of copper, one of them is given a cup of silver, and Cuchulainn, of course, is given a cup of gold. And this is a clear indication of how they should be ranked. But they then start arguing about what this means. And the one who got the copper, of course, tells you that copper is the most valuable of all the metals because it's the most widely distributed and the most useful. And therefore it means that he has won the contest. And they continue arguing about the meaning of the metals, and so finally they have to go through 3 tests in which the 3 metals appear every time, but they refuse to recognize the ranking that they represent until at the end, when they're fighting against horrible apparitions in this house, and the 2 who got the copper and the silver are unable to withstand them and run out, and only Cuchulainn is left inside. And at that point, the magician, who is the arbitrator, tells them, well, now you know what the gold means. There you can't argue with the fact that Cuchulainn has come out above the others in the 3 tests, so that the original judgment was sound, but you had to prove it through going through 3 different episodes of testing. Wow. Okay, well, eventually the story progresses to the resolution, which means that fertility is brought back from the depths of the land to the community. The person who was lost is found again. The person who had the magical object returns with it to where he's expected. And you have to find a closing formula to indicate that the story's over and that you're back in our time. In Scotland, people say, as Rak me an Shiniad, I guess Rakshiad and show me. That is, Rakiad rather, Rakiad and show me. That is, I left them there and they left me here. Which is the way you close it. In Ireland, I said prayer for the dead. The blessing on the dead is the traditional closing formula for any story. But if the story is particularly important, you give a pedigree for it. You say, and I know this story because my father taught it to me, or an older person taught it to me, you name the person. And you will usually also use a blessing that you actually find at the end of the manuscript of the time, of the Cattle Raid of Cooley, in the Middle Ages, which says, a blessing on anyone who hears the story or repeats it to anyone. And the modern storyteller actually still says that. He says, you know, a blessing on anyone hearing this story now, and a blessing on anyone who tells it to anyone again in the future. May all people be blessed by hearing this story. And you have this also actually in Hindu. formulations of mythological stories that are listened to at certain festivals, where you actually listen to the story and you get a blessing from it. And often the story contains the blessing as the final formula. So you can actually see strong continuity between these traditions of storytelling and throughout the Indo-European world. Any questions? Comments?
What are some good sources to find in English, some of these stories?
Well, the Scottish stories, actually, if you can look up the Popular Tales of the West Highlands, right? John Francis Campbell was collected in the mid-19th century at the time, and this tradition was really dying in Gaelic Scotland, but that's sort of painstakingly recorded.
What was the title of that again?
Popular Tales of the West Highlands. And that's, some of them are both in Gaelic and English, so you can actually compare the way it's translated. In Irish, there's an enormous amount. I mean, you can look up in Ballads, which is the Irish folklore journal. I mean, some of the articles are in Irish, but most of them are in English. You'll find careful studies of comparisons of these stories and different techniques for telling them and putting them in context. A problem with a lot of the folktale collections that you find, Irish folk tales like Yeats collected and so forth, is that you don't have the context. He tells the story as a literary story, and you don't get the sense that it's being told to a particular audience. The ones that are more carefully collected by folklorists will give you the comments of the storyteller as he introduces it to the audience, and will give the conclusion of the storyteller. That's often left out. You don't have the sense of him actually talking to anyone except to the reader.
Could I just say that I know that Popular Tales of the West Highlands and really all these stories are on the internet on sites
That's
like
right, yeah.
Sacred Texts and Ancient
That's
Texts,
right.
and they'll go and they'll have them, Welsh tales, Scottish tales,
Right.
Manx
Okay.
tales, whatever. So.
Yeah.
So Google.
I was a bit confused, and I don't know why. The source of Fenian, now there was a person first? I mean, does it come from a person?
Well, Fenian, it's anglicization of Fian.
Yeah.
Fian is a warrior band. And you talk about Fenian tales, meaning tales that have to do with these warrior bands. The
Okay,
Fian.
so it's a special kind of warrior, but it's the
Right.
warrior band and not somebody who started
It's not a
it.
person, no. But Finn, right, Finn McCool is a Fenian.
Okay,
So stories about Fenians usually involve Finn McCool.
so he was a special one for the storytellers.
Right.
Okay.
He was a special subject for storytellers. There's most of the stories about the Fianna center around him. They have him as a character somewhere. He's very much like King Arthur in a way. A lot of Arthurian stories are very much like Fenian stories, except that King Arthur originally was not a king in a court somewhere. He was a guerrilla leader, and
Yeah.
his followers were sort of fighting in the forest and living the same kind of life as the Fenians did. So there are a lot of thematic similarities between Arthurian stories, especially as they're told in Brythonic Celtic languages, and Fenian stories from Ireland and Scotland.
I've heard the term often, but I've never really gotten it together.
In the 19th century, people got a strange idea about them. Because they were warriors, they thought that they were basically soldiers defending Ireland. And so that's how it became a political term, where you had the Fenians, who were basically Irish revolutionaries fighting against the British government. But that's not at all what the Fenians are in mythological tradition. They don't have that role at all. They're certainly not patriots. They're mercenaries. I mean, that's how they make their living, is that they're not tied down to a particular land or political entity. They're independent of all that.
With all their supernatural abilities. et cetera.
Yes,
Yeah.
they're independent of that. They're close to the land, and the land is unpolitical. The land is just the land.
Is there any tradition at all or evidence that, let's say if someone is telling the stories, would they finish the story? Or is there any evidence that they would say, all right, tomorrow night
Yes,
we'll do
yes,
more?
definitely. In fact, you have
They
it.
leave them cliffhanging?
Yes, no, certainly. So the Eamon Burke had a gigantic story. I think that's the longest story we've ever recorded from folk tradition. It's called Ocher Macreen and Ocher, the son of a king in Ireland. And that takes forever to tell. I mean, you have to do it in several sittings. And this was not unusual in the older days. In Wales, as a matter of fact, the people who made the Arthurian Legends popular in the rest of Europe, cyfarwyddiaid, people who... Cyfarwydd is putting together of symbols, putting together of images, and that's the craft of the storyteller. And the Mabinogion, of course, the Mabinogion tales come out of that tradition. And you know, the Mabinogi, right, the main story in there, is in 4 branches. And the 4 branches are there because you can't tell the story in one sitting. You have to tell it in 4 sittings. So there's sort of a transition between each one of the branches. Say, more next time, you know.
Keep them coming back to the hearth on those cold Celtic nights.
If these storytellers were men, was this their job? Were they paid for it?
No.
Or they would go into the homes, would they...
No, they were paid for it in the sense that they would get gifts.
I don't want to say take it
Yeah.
out and trade, but I mean,
Yeah.
like in exchange for food.
Yes, yes.
So
They
they
would
fed that
certainly...
way.
You see, it was a blessing on the community. There was a literal blessing to have a story told. You know, a blessing on anyone who hears this story. It was a religious function. And so,
But they
yes...
wouldn't do it outside.
No, they wouldn't do it elsewhere. They wouldn't do it
outside.
Outside in the cold, no.
Yeah.
They would do it in someone's house or in the storyteller's house. But usually, you know, someone would be the host and would have everybody come over
Feed
to
them.
listen to a particular story, and they would feed them, and they would give something special as a gift to the storyteller, definitely. That is, because of his function, he would receive material goods that were necessary for him.
Would this be his, I don't want to say profession exactly, but would this be his job? Or would he be
It would be one of his
something
jobs. He would be
else
doing something else
in the
as well.
summer?
Yes, he would be
Farming,
doing something else.
whatever.
Usually, yeah, definitely. As I said, there were women. One of the greatest Breton storytellers was the woman Marguerite Philippe, who's one of Luzel, François Luzel, as he's called in French, was the greatest collector of Breton folklore in the 19th century. He very painstakingly took down the recitals of, again, these kinds of sacred storytellers in Brittany that was still around at the time, and one of his informants was Marguerite Philippe, who had some of the greatest sort of large-scale versions of the mythological stories, and she was a woman. And in Brittany it seemed to have been less unusual for women to do this, for some reason.
Thank you for a very enjoyable
Yeah.
time.
Oh, well, thank you. It lasted into the 20th century in Scotland. In fact, we have very good recordings of that, in which the same stories are told, but in strict verse, and they're usually chanted. That is, they're not sung the way a ballad would be sung to a song, to a tune that we recognize, but just on certain pitches, instead of chanted in a kind of like a church chant almost. And it continued it was obviously still in Ireland in the 19th century. Probably a lot of it disappeared at the time of the famine. And there were still some people in Donegal who knew how to do it around the 1940s. And there's some recordings of those. But otherwise, everything we know is from Scotland. And in Scotland, again, there was a tradition of doing it in the dark of the year, and people would often do it as a kind of trick-or-treating thing. They would be reciting these, we could call them ballads, although they're not, they're narrative poems that are chanted, and they would go from house to house, and they would get gifts for doing this. Again, because there was a blessing to have these songs performed.
Sort of like wassailing.
Yes, it's very similar, except in this case the ritual element is more obvious. Yeah, wassailing, essentially you drink to the health of the people, and that's the blessing that you give them. Whereas there you're reciting the stories of the Fenians, essentially, because you're doing it in verse, chanting, and it's the same kind of blessing as if the storyteller were telling it to you.
I noticed one of the books you have there is in Gaelic. The whole book
Yeah,
is in Gaelic.
the whole book is, yeah.
Oh, can I just look at what the letters look like?
Sure.
Like accent over some of the letters.
Alexei, can I see the third one is in English?
Yeah, the red one's in but has some Gaelic in it.
Wow. So you can read this and understand it?
Yes, sure. Well, I teach
you,
Irish.
you teach it?
Yes.
Oh, wow. Did you learn, how did you learn to...
I lived on the Aran Islands in the 60s.
Oh, really? So you learned from the people by living among
Absolutely,
them?
yeah. No, I never
Wow.
took an Irish class in my life, actually.
Sorry,
Except
you
Old
lived
Irish.
Where?
In the Aran Islands, off the west coast of Ireland.
Wow. Interesting.
Sure.
The accent over the letter, does that make the letter more
It makes it
stronger,
long.
pronounced longer?
It's a long vowel.
So it's even?
Eamon. Eamon de Boer. Steelt.
Oh.
Shanaki? How did you?
Shanachie.
I'm scared to turn it off.
Shanachie.
Alexei, I'm scared to turn it off again and you immediately start saying something else interesting.